the legendary bomber, or the greatest mistake of Soviet engineers? Why do controversies still surround this polarizing machine? Friends, today I will tell you about the Pe-2, the most ambiguous aircraft of the Second World War. For many novices, a flight in this plane was a one-way ticket. Just consider: no heating in winter, unreliable communication, intense G-loads during dives, and handling that didn't forgive the slightest tremor in one's hands. This bomber even managed to kill its own creator. But wait, how then did this design failure manage to determine the outcome of entire battles and crush the pride of the Luftwaffe, the legendary German Junkers? Today, no dry lectures, only the hard truth and insights from those who were there. I recommend watching until the very last second. The hidden secrets of this plane are guaranteed to shock you. 540 kilometers per hour. Let's pause on this figure for a second. In 1941, most German fighters that encountered Soviet planes over the front line flew at about the same speed or slightly faster, not much more. And the Pe-2 was a bomber, a machine with bombs in its bay, a crew of 3, targeting equipment, and dive brakes. A bomber that could outrun a fighter on pure speed. This is important. It changes the entire perception of what the Peshka was in the Soviet aviation system. 2 Klimov M105 engines, liquid-cooled V-12s, each with over 1,000 horsepower. To understand the scale, the power of one such engine is roughly equal to the power of 10 modern mid-class passenger cars. 2 such motors pulled an 8-ton machine to the speed of a courier train, only in the air and without rails. Now, the bombs. Structurally, the Pe-2 could carry up to 1,200 kilograms of bombs. That sounds impressive, but in practice, they rarely flew with such a load. Why? A full 1,200 kilogram load noticeably reduced speed and impaired maneuverability, the very qualities that made the Peshka survivable over the target. Therefore, the actual combat load was usually about 600 to 800 kilograms. Less, but more accurate, faster, and with a much higher chance of returning home. 6 to 8 standard 100 kilogram aerial bombs, or a few larger ones. Some were placed in the internal bomb bay, others on external mounts under the wings. And this is where it gets interesting. This plane had no armor, none at all. Not a sheet of armored steel around the pilot, nor protective screens for the engines. Nothing. For comparison, the Soviet Il-2 attack aircraft, which operated at low altitudes over the battlefield, carried up to 700 kilograms of armor. It was literally a flying armored tub. The Pe-2 didn't have a single gram, and yet it returned. Returned with holes in the wings, with damaged rudders, with gaps in the fuselage through which the wind whistled. Mechanics looked at such machines after landing and couldn't understand how they even made it back. The secret lay in 2 things. First, self-sealing fuel tanks. A regular fuel tank is just a container for fuel. A bullet hits, fuel leaks, then fire. A self-sealing tank works differently. Its walls are made of several layers of special rubber. When a bullet or shrapnel pierces such a tank, the rubber around the hole instantly swells and contracts, effectively sealing the puncture. The fuel stops leaking in seconds. But even if the fuel leaks, it's not yet a catastrophe, because there is a second solution, an inert gas system. This means the space above the fuel in the tanks was filled not with air, but with a special inert gas. Usually, engine exhaust gases passed through a cooler. Inert gas does not support combustion. A spark hits, there is nothing to ignite. No oxygen, no fire. These 2 solutions combined gave the plane, without a single sheet of armor, survival chances that even its opponents marveled at. But this was only one side of the Peshka, the technical one, the engineering one, the one that can be measured and explained. There was another side, the one that cannot be described by any numbers. And it was exactly this side that cost Soviet aviation very, very dearly. There is a concept in aviation, the temperament of a machine. This is not a technical term. It is a word that pilots use among themselves. Temperament is the character of an aircraft, how it behaves in your hands, whether it forgives mistakes or punishes them instantly and brutally. The Pe-2 had temperament in abundance. Let's first understand the context. The Soviet pilot training system at the beginning of the war assumed the following. A young pilot mastered the Pe-2. The Petlyakov Pe-2 is a training biplane with an open cockpit, a wooden frame covered with fabric. Speed, about 120 kilometers per hour. 2 wings, one 100-horsepower engine. A machine so docile and forgiving that it was used for training for decades. The flight hour requirement before transitioning to the Pe-2 was about 30 hours on this plane. 30 hours. Now imagine, you learn to ride a bicycle. 30 hours. And then you are told, sit behind the wheel of a racing car with 2 turbocharged engines. Right now. Good luck. The Pe-2 was a fundamentally different machine in every parameter. Speed 4.5 times higher. 2 engines instead of 1, which means a fundamentally different behavior during the failure of one of them. Higher wing loading, much greater inertia, and the most dangerous part, behavior during takeoff and landing. The Pe-2, under certain conditions, tended to, as pilots said, slip out of your hands. During takeoff, the plane could veer sharply to the side, due to the difference in engine thrust or crosswinds. An inexperienced pilot would instinctively press the pedal, trying to level the machine, and would worsen the situation. It was a matter of seconds, a fraction of a second. During landing, its own difficulties. The Pe-2 approached at a speed significantly higher than the speed of most single-engine planes of that time. The glide path, the angle of descent before touchdown, required precise calculation. Reduce the throttle a little too early, the machine sinks prematurely. A little too late, you fly past the target point and run off the runway. At the same time, the pilot had not a single extra hour of experience. Punev, who flew the Peshka from 1942 to 1945, spoke about this directly. The machine required the pilot's constant attention. Not from time to time, constantly. The slightest relaxation at a critical moment, and the plane no longer listens to you. And here arises the question that should be asked out loud. Why, with such piloting requirements, was the entry threshold so low? 30 hours on a training plane. It was knowingly insufficient. Everyone understood this. Instructors, commanders, and the pilots themselves. The answer is simple and bitter at the same time. It was 1941. Then 1942. Planes were needed now. Pilots were needed now. There was no time for long training. And for this lack of time, they paid a specific price. Accidents during takeoff and landing that could have been avoided with proper training. The most dangerous minutes for a Pe-2 pilot are not the moment of diving over the target, not anti-aircraft fire, not enemy interceptors. It is the first and last minutes of every flight, at their own airfield. But among everyone whom this machine did not forgive, there was one person whose story stands apart. Because he knew this plane better than anyone in the world, he created it. January 12, 1942, Kazan. Early morning. Frost. Vladimir Petlyakov boarded the Pe-2, not as a pilot, as a passenger. He was flying to Moscow, a work trip, one of many flights that the designer made for production business. The plane taxied to the runway, took off, and soon crashed. The machine crashed near Kazan shortly after takeoff. The search team found the wreckage. There were no survivors. 5 people were on board, and none of them survived, including Vladimir Mikhailovich Petlyakov, who was 52 at the time. The creator of the Peshka died on board the Peshka. This would be just a tragic coincidence if not for one fact, a fact that makes this story truly uncomfortable. The official cause of the crash was not definitively established. The commission worked. Documents were drawn up. Versions were considered. Among them, a fire on board, equipment failure, pilot error, unfavorable weather conditions. But no final answer that would close the issue completely ever appeared. Think about this for a second. The chief designer of one of the country's key combat aircraft dies in January 1942, at the most critical period when Pe-2 production is operating at maximum capacity and every experienced specialist is worth their weight in gold. And the cause remains unestablished. These are not conjectures. These are simply facts that history recorded and left open. What happened to the Pe-2 program after this? Here, the answer is unequivocal. The program continued. Production did not stop for a single day. The plane did not undergo radical changes. And here is a separate story. Usually, when a chief designer leaves, new people with new ideas come into the project. Redesigns begin, modernizations, attempts to improve what already works. With the Pe-2, this didn't happen. The plane remained as Petlyakov conceived it. Certain improvements were introduced, more powerful engines in later series, minor changes in armament, upgrades to individual systems. But the concept, the design, the very essence of the machine, left untouched. Some aviation historians consider this a miscalculation. The plane could have received more powerful armament and better conditions for the crew if it had been taken seriously. Others believe it was the best possible decision. Why break what works in conditions where every month and every produced plane counts? Both sides, apparently, are right. But whatever historians think, the pilots thought about something else. They had no time for discussions about design decisions. They needed to get into this machine, every morning, in any weather. And we need to talk separately about what awaited the pilot inside the cockpit, about the conditions in which he flew, fought, and simply tried to remain human. Because this is a separate story, no less important than everything we have talked about so far. Imagine such a morning, 5 o'clock, dark, minus 25 degrees. You walk to the plane. The mechanic helps you climb into the cockpit. You buckle up. You seal the canopy. The engines start, one, the other. You taxi to the runway. And now you are in the air. You gain altitude, 3,000 meters, 4, 5. At an altitude of 5,000 meters in winter, the temperature outside drops to minus 40 or 50 degrees. And now, the most important thing. The Pe-2 cockpit had no heating. None at all. No tubes with warm air from the engines. No electric seat heating. Not even a simple heat exchanger. A flight suit, fur boots, gloves. All this helped partially. But at altitude and during a long flight, the cold still reached the body. First, the toes would go numb. Then, the hands. Punev recalled, in extreme cold, the fingers would become so stiff that gripping the control stick in a normal hold was impossible. One had to pilot the plane literally with the whole palm, pressing it against the grip instead of holding it with fingers. Think about this, with the whole palm, at a speed of 500 kilometers per hour, with bombs on board, over enemy territory. And that's not all. The second weak point was the radio communication. Radio equipment on the Pe-2, as indeed on most Soviet combat aircraft at the beginning of the war, worked unstably. Interference, static, fragments of phrases. Inside the crew, between the pilot, the bombardier, and the radio operator, communication worked somehow. If you really tried, you could hear your comrades through the noise of the engines. Hearing your wingman, the pilot of the second plane in the pair, was already significantly more difficult. And receiving a clear command from the ground, from the command post, was, according to pilots' memories, practically impossible in real combat conditions. What did this mean in practice? It meant that a group of Pe-2s in the air depended heavily on pre-agreed actions, on what had been discussed on the ground before the flight. Improvising in the air, reacting to a rapidly changing situation on command from the ground, this was extremely difficult. Pilots made decisions independently, often in conditions where no person on the ground knew exactly what was happening over their heads. For the sake of fairness, it must be said, this was not a unique problem of the Pe-2. This was a systemic problem of Soviet aviation of that period. The aviation industry solved problems in order of priority: speed, armament, range. Crew comfort was much lower on that list. The German Junkers 87 had a cockpit heating system. The American Douglas Dauntless was designed with long combat sorties over the ocean in mind. The Pe-2 was designed primarily as a combat machine. The human inside, that's important, but secondary. That was the philosophy. And pilots lived with this philosophy, flew in the cold, listened to the static in their headphones, piloted with their palms instead of fingers, and then went into a dive. With a load that most people have never even heard of. With a load that is difficult to describe in words, but can be explained with numbers. There is a unit of measurement used by physicists, engineers, and pilots. It is called the G-force. One such unit is the normal force of gravity. What you feel right now, sitting or standing, your own weight. When a plane abruptly changes its direction of movement, gains altitude, pulls out of a dive, performs a steep turn, the G-load increases. The body becomes heavier. 2 Gs. You weigh twice as much as usual. Standing up from the seat is already difficult. 4 Gs. Lifting an arm requires effort. Blood under the force of gravity leaves the head and goes down to the legs. Your field of vision begins to narrow. It reddens. It darkens at the edges. 6 Gs. Keeping your head straight becomes a physical task. The neck carries a weight it was not designed to carry. Vision narrows to a tunnel. 8 Gs. Temporary loss of consciousness without special equipment and training occurs in a few seconds. The Pe-2, when pulling out of a dive, developed a load of up to 12 Gs. 12. If you weigh 80 kilograms, at the moment of pulling out of the dive, your body presses against the seat with a force of almost a ton, 960 kilograms. This is not a metaphor. This is physics. At that moment, blood leaves the head so rapidly that, without special skills, the pilot loses consciousness in 2 or 3 seconds. Now add to this the following. Before diving, the pilot has already spent several hours in a cockpit without heating. Fingers are on the verge of numbness. In his ears, the static of interference. Below the wings, enemy anti-aircraft fire. And now he enters the dive. The nose goes down. The angle increases. 60 degrees. 70. The ground is rushing toward him. The speed is 500 kilometers per hour. 520. 540. He keeps the sight on the target, with numbing fingers, with his whole palm. It is a matter of seconds. Drop. And now, the pull-out. Pull the stick back, sharply. 12 Gs press on the body in less than a second. Darkness. Not metaphorical, literal. Blood leaves the eyes. Vision momentarily goes completely blank. The pilot pulls the machine out of the dive almost blindly, by feel, by the position of the body, by what he remembers from training. Then vision returns. The ground is below again. The sky is above again. Hands are shaking. That was one run. Timofey Punev made up to 4 such runs per day. Not once a week, not in training conditions. 4 times a day in combat sorties. From 1942 to 1945. That is 3 years. Medics who studied the effects of repeated high G loads on the body recorded the following. Regular loads exceeding 8 Gs, when systematically repeated, begin to irreversibly affect the vessels of the ocular fundus and the cardiovascular system as a whole. Punev flew with a load of 12 Gs. 4 times a day. 3 years. Think for a second about what this means for the human body, and that there were thousands of such pilots. They were not superheroes. They were people. People who climbed into this machine again and again because they had to. And while these people were flying and fighting, far from the front line, in cold factory halls, other people were making planes for them. And we need to talk about those people too, because their story is perhaps the most poignant part of everything we are telling today. The Pe-2 was assembled at 2 aviation plants, Plant number 22 in Kazan and plant number 39, evacuated in 1941 from Moscow to Irkutsk, beyond the Urals, far from the front line. The word evacuated sounds calm and official. In practice, it looked like this. Machine tools were removed from foundations, loaded into railway cars, transported thousands of kilometers to the east, unloaded in an open field, and immediately started working. Sometimes, literally under the open sky, while walls of the future factory building were being built around them. Winter, Siberia. -30. And next to the unfinished walls, machines already working. The build quality, despite all this, was, according to the unanimous testimony of pilots, surprisingly high. Punev spoke about this directly. There were practically no complaints about the machine itself, about how it was assembled. Part fitting, reliability of units, general manufacturing quality, everything was done conscientiously. This fact itself requires reflection, because you need to understand whose hands these planes were assembled with. When the men went to the front, women came to the factories. Teenagers came. Children came. Punev recalled the following. In the workshops where the Pe-2 was assembled, boys and girls 10 to 12 years old stood at the machines. 10 to 12. Not 15. Not 16. 10 to 12 years old. They couldn't reach the work surface of the machine tool. Wooden crates were placed under their feet. They would stand on these crates and work. The shifts were long. They met their quotas. The workshop was not heated, or it was heated so poorly that the difference was negligible. The same hands that went numb for pilots in the cockpit went numb for children at the machines. Only the pilot could wear fur gloves. The child at the machine had no gloves. You cannot work with metal in gloves. The rations were meager. Ration cards, norms, the bare necessities, and not always even that. And here is the story that Punev told especially. Once a pigeon flew into the workshop. Just a pigeon. It flew in through some hole in the roof or wall, and found itself inside a huge room humming with machines. A command went through the workshop instantly. Look out. One word. Everyone understood. Production stopped. The machines fell silent. Dozens of children, who had just been assembling parts for a combat aircraft, took out slingshots. The most ordinary slingshots that boys made themselves from twigs and rubber, and began the hunt. The pigeon was caught. That was dinner. Punev, telling this story, always paused, because in it is the whole truth about what price was paid for every produced machine, not just by labor, not just by sleep deprivation and cold, by childhood hunger, by children's hands, by children who stood on crates to reach the machine. The plane in which the pilot piloted with his whole palm because of numb fingers was assembled by hands that weren't even 13 years old yet. These two people never met. The pilot didn't know the name of the child who tightened a bolt on his machine. The child didn't know the name of the pilot who would get his work. But they were connected by this plane, by this Peshka. And now, when we understand who built this plane and who flew it, we need to return to the machine itself. Because inside it was something that almost no one talks about. Solutions that were ahead of their time. Solutions that saved lives, including the lives of those very pilots with numb fingers. There is a paradox that haunts the Pe-2 throughout its history. On one hand, the lack of heating, unreliable radio communication, no armor, conditions for the crew that are hard to call acceptable. On the other hand, electrical systems that simply did not exist on most aircraft of that time. These two things lived in one plane, and this is not an accident. This is a reflection of the philosophy we talked about earlier. The machine comes first, the human later. But the machine itself is thought out to the details. Let's break it down specifically. A typical aircraft of the early 40s of the 20th century was controlled predominantly mechanically. Cables, rods, levers, everything by hand. To extend the landing gear, pull a lever. To open the bomb bay, pull another lever. To change the angle of the flaps, again by hand, with effort that depended on the speed of the airflow. At high speeds, some operations required significant physical effort from the pilot. Literally, lean with your whole body on the lever. The Pe-2 went a different path. The aircraft was equipped with an unusually large number of electric drives and systems for that time. The landing gear was retracted by an electric motor. The flaps were controlled electrically. Dive brakes, those very plates that slowed the speed during vertical descent, were also extended by an electric drive. What did this give the pilot in practice? Imagine, you are driving a car on a mountain pass in the dark, and you need to simultaneously shift gears, adjust headlight brightness, and open the window. Now imagine that shifting gears happens automatically. You just need to press a button. This is not a trifle. This is a relief of attention at a moment when every fraction of a second and every percentage of concentration is worth a life. But the most important electrical solution on board the Pe-2 was not the landing gear drive or the flaps. It was the automatic pull-out device. Here is how it worked. At the moment of diving, the pilot was completely absorbed in targeting. The target is in the crosshairs. Speed is increasing. The altimeter is dropping. 2,000 meters to the ground. 1,500. At an altitude of 1,500 meters, the automaton triggered forcibly. Without the pilot's participation, without his command, the system automatically deflected the elevators, beginning to pull the plane out of the dive. Even if the pilot had lost consciousness at that moment from the G-load, even if he was wounded, even if he had been distracted by the target for a fraction of a second, the machine pulled itself out. 1,500 meters is not that much. Considering the speed of more than 500 kilometers per hour and the inertia of a heavy machine, there was practically no time left to correct an error. The automaton completely removed this problem. Now here is what is interesting. On the German Junkers 87 dive bomber, a similar system appeared earlier. The Germans were pioneers in this exact solution. But on most other dive bombers of that time, there was no pull-out automaton at all. The American Douglas Dauntless, the Japanese Aichi, the pilot pulled the machine out himself. Always himself. Only himself. On the Pe-2, the system was installed from the very first production machines. Not as an option, not as experimental equipment, as a standard solution. And here is a small detail that speaks volumes. Pe-2 pilots almost never mentioned this automaton in their interviews and memoirs. Not because it didn't work, but because it simply worked. Quietly, reliably, every time. The best mechanism is the one you don't think about, that just does its job. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented the plane from burning. The inert gas system prevented it from exploding. The pull-out automaton prevented it from crashing into the ground. 3 systems, 3 invisible shields, each of which the pilot almost never thought about consciously, because they worked for him. And all this, on a plane without a single sheet of armor, assembled by 10 to 12-year-old children in unheated workshops beyond the Urals. But the most convincing argument in favor of the Pe-2 is not the blueprints, not the patents for electrical systems, not the dive pull-out automaton. The most convincing argument unfolded over real targets, in real combat sorties, when everything we've talked about came together in one point and yielded a result. Summer 1943, somewhere over occupied territory. Timofey Punev is leading his machine at an altitude of 3,500 meters. Below, railroad tracks. On the tracks, a train. Not just a freight train, a train with ammunition. Dozens of cars. Shells, cartridges, explosives. Everything the enemy needed to continue the fighting on this section of the front. Next to the train, on adjacent tracks, there are several more trains. Equipment. Enemy manpower. Intelligence worked accurately. The target is confirmed. Punev enters the combat course. The nose of the machine goes down. The angle increases. The ground approaches. In the sight. The head of the train, the locomotive, and the first cars. Drop. The bomb landed accurately. What happened next, Punev observed already during the pullout from the dive, when the machine was gaining altitude. The first explosion pulled the second one after it. The second. The third. The detonation went along the train like fire along a fuse, car after car, faster and stronger. The blast wave covered the adjacent tracks. When the smoke cleared a little, almost nothing was left of several trains. One run, one bomb at the right point. This is not luck. This is dive bombing performed by a trained crew on the right machine. But Punev was not the only one. There are documented accounts of Group Pe-2 strikes on enemy armored vehicles. Imagine the scene. A column of armored vehicles is moving along a road. This is not just equipment. This is the deciding force on a specific sector of the front on a specific day. A group of Pe-2s makes a run as a flight. Several machines, each at its own dive point. Each pilot with his own target in the sight. The strike takes less than a minute. After it, the column ceases to exist as a combat unit. Not because every machine is destroyed, but because the head and tail ones are disabled by precision hits, and the entire column stopped, trapped on the road, helpless. This is exactly how the Pe-2 influenced the outcome of small but critically important clashes on individual sections of the huge front. Not strategic bombing of cities, not mass raids on rear facilities. Precision strikes in the right place at the right moment. A surgeon, not a sledgehammer. And here we need to put the Peshka next to its main competitor, with the machine that the whole world knows better, with that very roaring Junkers 87. The German dive bomber Junkers 87 is perhaps the most recognizable aircraft of the Second World War. Characteristic broken wing, fixed landing gear with fairings in the shape of inverted drops, and most importantly, the Junkers sirens. Special propellers on the landing gear struts that created a piercing howl during a dive. This sound was a deliberate psychological weapon. It was supposed to paralyze. And in 1939, and 1940, and 1941, it did paralyze. But the Junkers 87 had a weak spot. A fundamental, structural weak spot. The maximum speed of the Junkers 87 was about 390 kilometers per hour. The Pe-2 flew at 540, a difference of 150 kilometers per hour. This is not just a figure. It means the following. By mid-1942, any Soviet fighter could intercept and destroy a Junkers 87 practically without effort. The Germans understood this. That is exactly why the Junkers 87 from a certain moment could operate only with fighter cover. Without escort, it was an easy target. The Pe-2 in those same years did not need cover with the same urgency. Its speed alone was part of its defense. By 1943, the Junkers 87 was essentially obsolete as a frontline dive bomber on the Eastern Front. The Germans continued to use it, but in other roles and conditions. The Pe-2 in 1943 was still a full-fledged and dangerous combat machine. In 1944, too. In 1945, too. The plane that started fighting in 1941 remained relevant until the very last day, without radical design changes. This is the real answer to the question of what the Peshka was. But the final verdict is yet to come. So, before us is the Pe-2. A plane without armor, without heating, with unreliable radio communication. Created from a fighter that no one asked to be redesigned into a bomber. Assembled by children beyond the Urals in unheated workshops. Requiring skill from the pilot that most pilots at the beginning of the war simply didn't have. And yet, a machine that, without radical changes, went through the entire war from the first to the last day. 4 years. Think about this. In the aviation of the 40s, 4 years is an entire epoch. Planes became obsolete rapidly. What was advanced in 1941, by 1943, could not stand comparison with new developments. The Junkers 87 became obsolete. The Douglas Dauntless was removed from frontline aircraft carriers by the middle of the war in the Pacific. Most dive bombers of those years shared this fate. The Pe-2 did not. This is not a coincidence. And this is not inertia. This is a verdict. When a plane remains in service for 4 years without fundamental changes, it means only one thing. Its creator guessed right. Guessed accurately and for a long time. Vladimir Petlyakov, who worked in a closed design bureau, who redesigned a fighter into a bomber in tight deadlines by order from above, guessed right. Now, about the diametrically opposite assessments. Why did some pilots idolize the Peshka while others cursed it? The answer, if you figure it out, is simple. Those who cursed it, as a rule, arrived at it with minimal training. 30 hours on a training plane, and immediately into the cockpit of a complex, temperamental, demanding machine. For them, the Pe-2 was a source of constant stress and danger. And they were right. With their training, absolutely right. Those who idolized it managed to master the machine for real, felt its speed, understood its logic, learned to work with its temperament instead of fighting against it. For them, the Pe-2 was a tool that gave opportunities unavailable on other machines. And they were also right. The same plane, two completely different truths. This is the real portrait of the Pe-2. Not an unambiguous hero, not an unambiguous villain. A machine with character. A machine that gave as much as the pilot was ready to invest in it. There is one more way to evaluate the plane. Not through technical specifications. Not through combat episodes. Through production figures. Over the years of the war, the Soviet aviation industry produced about 11,000 Pe-2 aircraft. 11,000 machines. Each with self-sealing tanks. With an inert gas system. With a dive pull-out automaton. With 2 Klimov engines, each with over 1,000 horsepower. 11,000 machines, assembled including by the hands of children 10 to 12 years old, who stood on wooden crates to reach the machine, who hunted pigeons with slingshots because it was dinner. When Timofey Punev found out about this, he said that he couldn't think about it before a flight. It was too much. I think he meant the following. When you sit in the cockpit and prepare for a flight, you think about the mission, the course, the target. You don't think about whose hands assembled this machine. But if you do think about it, you understand that the responsibility becomes different. Not just to complete the mission, not just to return. Return also because someone very small and very hungry in a very cold workshop did everything they could for you. That is the whole verdict. The Pe-2 is not just a plane. This is a snapshot of an entire epoch. Engineering genius and human cost. A machine without armor that survived. A machine without heating on which they flew in any frost. A machine created from another plane, which outlived all its competitors. Ambiguous? Yes, but that is exactly what real legends are like. Not those that are beautiful on a pedestal, but those that are honest in the air. The Peshka was honest in the air, until the very last day.